Have you ever felt like you're in a place where you don't understand why you're there? Like everything around you happened by accident, a place where you just ended up. But what if that place, no matter how strange or uncomfortable, were part of a greater, divine plan? Today, we're going to talk about Esther, a woman who likely felt that way, a young orphan, unknown, and taken to a palace that wasn't hers. Could she have even imagined that she was there to save her entire people? As I hear her story, I can't help but feel that we, too, have those moments where nothing seems to fit. But when we look with eyes of faith, we notice that God places us in strategic spots, even when we don't understand why. Esther had to face her fears, the possibility of losing everything, even her life. And in this crossroads, I wonder, would I have been that brave? Would I have the faith to take that step? Join me, because this story isn't just about a queen in Persia, but about how God uses ordinary people to change the course of history. Maybe, by the end of this video, you'll find that you, too, are exactly where God wants you to be to fulfill a purpose you can't yet imagine. Are you ready to discover it? Esther wasn't always a queen. In fact, she started her life far from luxury and power. She was an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai, a devout man of principle who took on the responsibility of raising her in the faith and teaching her about the God of Israel. I imagine Mordecai not only taking care of Esther but also planting in her heart seeds of courage, love, and faithfulness to God, even in the midst of a foreign empire that didn't understand her beliefs. I find it incredible that, in God's plans, an orphan in Persia, someone who, by appearances, wasn't anything special, was chosen for a tremendous purpose. And it wasn't just Esther, Mordecai too. How often do we underestimate our role as an influence in others' lives? It makes me think that sometimes God calls us to support and lift someone, to prepare them for a greater purpose, even if we never see the end of that plan. Mordecai taught Esther to trust in God, and when the situation turned critical, he didn't hesitate to remind her of who she really was, not a Persian queen, but a daughter of God's people with a sacred mission. I wonder, are we that voice of faith and courage to those around us? Mordecai's influence was key in helping Esther make a decision that would change the destiny of her people. His role, though simple, was vital. He wasn't just an ordinary man, but someone willing to obey God and guide others on his path. So, when we look at Esther's life, we must also remember those God placed as mentors, guides, and supporters along our journey. Sometimes, our calling isn't to be the hero of the story, but to help someone else become it. God places us in specific places and moments, whether like Esther or Mordecai, to fulfill his perfect purpose. Imagine the opulence and splendor of the Persian court. Marble columns, luxurious carpets, and gold everywhere. But behind this beauty lay intrigues, envies, and ambitions. It was a place where a single word could seal the fate of a person or an entire people. In this hostile environment, where there was no room for mistakes, a deadly threat emerged. Haman, an influential man, filled with hatred and pride. His goal wasn't just a few enemies, but the entire Jewish people. It was as if Satan himself was behind this, seeking to destroy God's people. And why? Because Mordecai, the Jew, refused to bow to him. Seeing this, Haman decided that this lack of reverence needed to be paid for dearly. I think about how often, like Mordecai, we are tempted to give in, to bend our values a little just to avoid conflict. But he didn't yield. Mordecai stood firm in his faith, no matter the cost. And what about us? Can we stand firm when others pressure us to go against our faith? Then, Haman convinces the king to issue a decree, an edict of death against the entire Jewish people. Imagine the panic and uncertainty of knowing that, on a given day, an entire nation was set to be annihilated, and that nothing could reverse it because Persian law was irrevocable. This conflict shows us that when we decide to be faithful to God, it won't always be easy. Mordecai and Esther faced a real threat, a struggle in which they couldn't see the end. How would we feel if we knew that everything was against us, and that someone as powerful as Haman was determined to eliminate us? It's in these moments of despair that, like Esther, we're called to trust that God is already working, even when we can't see a way out. Haman's threat wasn't just a political challenge, it was a test of faith. Could God save them from such a firm sentence? To the world, it seemed like a lost cause, but to God, it was an opportunity to show his power and faithfulness. The story is about to change, and the question that arises is, will Esther and Mordecai be able to trust in God when everything seems lost? Esther now faces the most difficult decision of her life, risking appearing before the king uncalled, which could cost her life, or remaining silent and allowing her people to be annihilated. Can you imagine the emotional and spiritual weight this carried? Esther didn't just fear for her own life. The fate of an entire nation was at stake. I wonder, how would I react if I were in her place? Would I have the courage to risk my safety and position for the good of others? Esther found herself in a true dilemma of faith. On one hand, she felt the weight of responsibility. On the other, the fear of the consequences. Many times in the Christian life, we also face decisions that scare us, that make us doubt. We want to do what's right, but the risk of what we might lose makes us hesitate. This is where Mordecai steps in with those powerful words. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? This reminder awakens something deep within Esther, a sense of purpose and divine destiny. She wasn't there by chance. God had placed her in that place at that specific moment. I'm impressed by how her faith drives her to look beyond her fear, beyond the odds against her. It's as if, suddenly, she understands that her life doesn't belong to her alone, but is in God's hands to fulfill his will. And what about us? Do we dare to believe that we, too, are where we are for a divine purpose, even when the situation seems dangerous or difficult? This moment in Esther's life is a lesson for all of us. When God calls us to do something, we can't let fear hold us back. Her decision to act, to trust in God despite the risk, would change history forever. It's a call to faith, to believe that even in our darkest dilemmas, God is in control. Finally, the moment has arrived. Esther steps into the court, facing an audience with the king where her life hangs by a thread. Imagine the scene. The grand hall filled with guards, advisors, and nobles silently watching. And there she is, with her heart pounding, walking toward the throne without knowing if she will leave alive. This wasn't a mere act of bravery. It was an act of complete dependence on God. Esther knew that, according to Persian law, no one could approach the king without being summoned, yet she took the step. Here, Esther's faith is evident. She stood alone before a powerful and capricious authority, but her trust was in the Almighty God, who has the power to change any heart. To me, this is an incredible lesson. There are moments when we have to take a step of faith and trust that God will do his work, even when everything seems to be against us. When the king extends his golden scepter toward her, granting her permission to approach, I can imagine the relief on Esther's face. But this isn't just a sign of human grace. It's a reminder of the divine favor that accompanies her. God was working through that gesture to fulfill his purpose. How amazing! We sometimes forget that God can move people's hearts, that he is in control even in situations that seem impossible. Watching this scene, I can't help but wonder, what situations in our lives require this kind of faith, this level of courage? Esther teaches us that when we place everything in God's hands, he can open doors that no man can close. With the scepter extended, the resolution of this story begins. God is in charge, and the fate of the Jewish people is about to change forever. The moment of the banquet has arrived, and Esther stands before the king and Haman. It's incredible to think of the courage Esther had to organize this banquet, knowing she was about to expose Haman's betrayal, a powerful figure in the Persian court. But she also knew that this was the perfect time, the moment orchestrated by God. Her patience and wisdom in waiting until the second banquet show profound intelligence and faith. How many times do we want to rush things out of fear instead of waiting for God's timing? Imagine the tension in the room, with the king curious about Esther's request and Haman unaware of what's about to be revealed. With impressive composure, Esther gathers her courage and exposes Haman's evil, revealing his plot to exterminate her people. I'm struck by how, in this critical moment, Esther doesn't seek personal revenge but justice and salvation for her people. She uses the position where God has placed her to intercede, and she does so with the calm and firmness of someone who knows God is by her side. When Esther finally reveals her identity as a Jew and the danger she and her people face, the king is filled with anger. I think about how God prepared every detail so that, at the right time, the truth would come to light. For me, this is a reminder that God is also working in our situations, even when we don't see it. He gives us the courage we need and the perfect timing to speak and act. It is at this banquet where everything falls into place. Esther fully trusts in God, and he honors that faith. Just as Esther was a voice of courage and truth, we are called to speak up at the right time, with the confidence that God is preparing the way. In the end, Esther's revelation marks the beginning of her people's deliverance and Haman's downfall. God transforms the darkest situation into an unexpected victory. The story of Esther shows us the power of courage and divine providence in our lives. It's remarkable how God uses ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Esther wasn't a warrior or a prophetess. She was a young woman filled with fears and doubts, yet with unshakable faith. In the decisive moment, she not only saved her people, but also became a testament to what God can do through someone willing to obey his call. I think of our own lives. We may not be facing the annihilation of a people, but each of us has situations where God calls us to be brave, to take a step of faith. Esther teaches us that it's not about having all the answers or being fearless, but about being willing to act despite fear, trusting that God has placed us where we are for a reason. The question is, are we willing to be used by him? This story also reminds me of the greatness of a God who is always in control, even when we don't understand it right away. Every challenge we face can be an opportunity to see his hand working in our lives if we just trust and wait for his timing. Today, I want to challenge you, like Esther, to dare to say yes to that call, to be an instrument of God wherever you are. He is still the same, and just as he guided Esther, he will also guide us. Esther's courage was not only for her time. It is an eternal example for all of us who seek to walk in faith. God is with us, and that, my brothers and sisters, is more than enough.